Hello. Sorry for the delay. Let's get into it. I found a couple of videos I wanted to go over about transhumanism. It goes further than transgenderism, more deeper, more broader. Same kind of thing. Goes further, kind of more almost like a root cause. Is kind of what I'm thinking. That's all. Let's do the first video. First one's shorter than the other. First one is from Max Landis. Max Landis was what's the best way to describe Max Landis? He was a scriptwriter, son of John Landis. He has very insightful things about movies, and I wanted to let's hear him talk about Jumanji and Jumanji 2 and transhumanism. Forgive the language if it's bad. You know, I don't think these guys are Christians. So let's go.
On my Instagram, I talked about Jumanji 2 being transhumanist propaganda. And of course, a lot of people were like, what does that mean? Because I said I liked the movie. I didn't want to answer on my Instagram, so I'm answering here. So I'm just going to talk for a second and try to explain what I meant. Now, in San Junipero, which is an episode of Black Mirror, an escape to a digital world is positioned not only as a way to escape death, which is huge, leaving our physical form into a kind of artificial heaven is positioned not as a bad thing, not as a trap, not as some sort of weird nether space where humanity is stuck forever, kind of like some sort of bardo in the Buddhist religion where we're just trapped, our souls are empty, but instead as this idyllic paradise that we can leave instead of experiencing physical death. It's not only positioned that way, but it's also positioned as a realm in which we can explore things, specifically our sexualities, in ways that we weren't allowed to when we had a physical form. A woman who's never done anything homosexual finds a homosexual relationship and happiness and fulfillment in a seeming everlasting afterlife as scored by Belinda Carlisle, Heaven is a Place on Earth. So it very literally is like, maybe technology is good. Then in what I think is the best episode of Black Mirror, because I think it's the smartest, Striking Vipers, you have I can't believe people didn't talk about it more because it's the bravest statement I've ever seen anything make about sexuality and gender and where our society is going, which is that it posits the idea that in a post-physical world, all of our ideas about heterosexuality, homosexuality, transsexuality, and gender are meaningless. None of it matters when we can segregate ourselves from our physical form and become a different thing, not simply an avatar, but an extension of our being, not simply an...
So I think you kind of get a sense of what's going on, what the greater thing is. It's almost like a ancient pagan sort of a blend of not just male and female sexuality, of just like the created order in general, just getting past that.
An icon to click on, but an actual representation of our true self. The idea, sort of the pseudo-religious idea of the soul, like what is humanity beyond consciousness? Well, turns out, if you're a dude who's married, you might want to fuck another dude's personality in a video game. And maybe he's a hot woman, or maybe you're a dude who's straight his whole life and you want to fuck another man as a man. And Striking Vipers really sort of articulately nails this transition and has one of the best endings of any Black Mirror episode, and just is the best one. And if you haven't watched it, it's just chef's kiss. It's perfect. And Anthony Mackie's brilliant. All the performances are brilliant. Doesn't matter. We're not here to talk about Black Mirror. So Jumanji 1 is a magic movie. The first Jumanji with Robin Williams is about a magical board game. The world of Jumanji is positioned as a pocket dimension or possibly an alternate dimension. The movie is magical realistic with a fantasy twist, so it doesn't go deep into its lore. We don't know almost anything about where the Jumanji video game came from. But it doesn't matter because it's fantasy. The Jumanji reboot series, which I think is really good, it's one of those things where you're watching it and you're like, this is good? The studio made a Jumanji, and it just feels, it's so nice when it's like the Lego movie where you go in and you're like, oh, it's good. But the Jumanji reboot series is science fiction. It's not magical. And similarly, it's magical realistic, at least at first, and therefore it doesn't waste any time going into the lore of where the Jumanji video game came from. In the sequels, it's a video game. If you don't know that, spoilers for the first 2 minutes of the Jumanji reboot, I don't care. So the interesting thing about Jumanji 1 is how it played with gender, race, and identity. Okay, and no one even really seemed upset about it because the movie was funny and it didn't out loud say what it was doing. But you have a traditionally feminine woman, a Western feminine woman, you know, oh my God, blah, 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 fashion and nails. That girl gets put into what is a more masculine trope than Jack Black. And then you have him putting out feminine, signaling feminine the whole movie because he's speaking as her. At first, she despises his body, but by the end of the movie, she's come to not only love his body, but feel comfortable expressing sexual arousal for the Jonas brother within that body. So she's okay to be horny as a man who has a totally different physical body type than her actual body. Similarly, a skinny white guy is put into a huge person of color with The Rock. You have this nerdy white kid becoming this dreamboat, Dr. Rock or whatever his name, Stoneheart or something. But what's so interesting about that is that as expressed through Jumanji 1 and 2, it's not a fantasy for him. Instead, it allows him to explore a part of his own personality. He doesn't become more like The Rock. He recognizes the things within himself that are like The Rock. At the opening of Jumanji 2, he's experiencing depression and anxiety because he no longer feels like The Rock. So I hope you're staying with me. I'm excited to explain this. All
right, so we're just kind of going over this to kind of follow along, kind of get a taste of how it's deeper than transgenderism, how it's this video itself kind of put this in my mind. I guess, we're getting on almost 2 years now. Right? So I'm kind of wondering, was it explicit in Jumanji? Is there like a greater goal in mind? Is there a greater propaganda going on? And him inside Hollywood, although he's on the outs due to some scandals and stuff, seems like it is a real thing, okay? A real propaganda thing. Anyway.
What's so interesting is that in the Jumanji reboot series, these entities that we beam into through this video game and this constructed digital world, or maybe fantasy world, the movie doesn't explain it, they are part of us. They are not merely a video game character, but they allow us to express and discover things within ourselves. The nerdy girl gets to be a hot girl with a nice body, and the big football player experiences what it's like to be short. Okay, so that one isn't perfect, but I'm sure if time goes on long enough, there will be a short people rights movement. So what's so fascinating about this is that in the sequel, we go a step further because now we have old people. Specifically, we have Danny Glover's character. Spoilers for Jumanji 2 Impact.
So again, is going beyond race, going beyond sexuality, gender.
Danny Glover's character has terminal cancer. And at the end of the movie, he chooses to stay in Jumanji as a horse. I'm sorry, as a horse? So he identifies as an animal. Okay, well, cute. It's a kid's movie, right? Well, no, because at one point they talk about how big the horse's dick is. So it's a sexualized flying horse that he can live as happily instead of accepting physical death. And this isn't positioned as a compromise, it's positioned as an escape. This is different from the way we used to portray this stuff, okay? Remember how much we all hated Cypher for being like, I'd rather live in the Matrix? But then some people were like, well, I'd rather live in the Matrix. And your friends were like, what? You wouldn't want to live in the real world? It's like, no, I don't want to eat the porridge and do the weird cave orgy. And it's like, yeah, I don't. Cypher's perspective, other than him selling out and murdering his friends, is theoretically valid. But it was a minority perspective. Now, as we become more and more comfortable with representing ourselves online, with performing our personalities, with creating a curated idea of ourselves, with
it's very insightful.
Plastic surgery levels at an all-time high, and most plastic surgeries being easier to achieve and cheaper than ever, and Facetune and Instagram, and it goes on. And I'm not one of those people, but when you watch at the end of a movie a guy being like, I'm going to live in a computer as a horse. And everyone in the movie goes, you can't help but feel it's portentous. And not
we're very easily manipulated, aren't we?
Pretentious, portentous, as in a portent of thing to come. Me explaining that.
Play the right music. Remember watching Man of Steel with my neighbor. And he was telling me how he didn't like the fact that Superman killed Zod in Man of Steel. And I said, when we were talking, I think we were in a diner afterwards. Well, Superman 2, Superman killed a defenseless Zod and didn't feel any regret about it, unlike Man of Steel. But the John Williams music was playing, so you don't remember it.
That to you was pretentious, but let's leave it alone. And let's talk about one last thing that is so endlessly fascinating about Jumanji and the place we're at with transhumanism. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just a pop movie,
No, not intentional. Okay.
well-written pop movie that is embracing the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist right now is, I want abs, but I don't want to work out. I want to be happy with how I look, but I don't want to have to leave the house to be seen. I want to hang out with my friends, but I'm not returning texts, I'm not returning calls. So like, I've been there, you've been there. Wouldn't it be amazing to be able to be something else, to be someone else? And isn't it possible that this is right around the corner, way sooner than we think? Movies are ending with main characters choosing to be immortal digital avatars. This is new and it's weird. Remember Lawnmower Man? Remember Tron? The world inside the computer used to be a cold illusion. Now the world inside the computer, Jumanji, is more beautiful than our real world could ever be. Ready Player One positions a world that has become postmodern to the point of suffocation. People are inundated with references and ideas from the past. Jumanji is an idea from the future. And that's what I mean by Jumanji is transhumanist propaganda. And keep your eyes open. The transhumanist stuff isn't going to go away anytime soon. In fact, I think it's going to become a lot more blatant.
Okay. Again, that guy is not a Christian. He's very liberal as far as I know. Been in Hollywood culture for a long time. Again, very insightful. So let's get to a Keith Woods video. If I saw this Paul Vanderklay, who is in some sort of Reformed denomination. I enjoy his YouTube channel, and he has some insightful stuff. Maybe not conservative-ish, conservative adjacent. So he put me onto this channel. They have he has this channel. Keith Woods does a really good job, and I wanted to go over this video. And let's give it a look. I'm going to comment every once in a while, partly because that's what I have to do for fair use, but also, but otherwise, I would just say, hey, go watch this video.
I wanted to talk a bit about the modern left and what gets called wokeism, because I think everyone recognizes there's something radically different about the modern version of the left and what's motivating and what's animating them than has been traditionally the case for the left. And wokeism itself is a strange kind of phenomenon that needs explanation. And I think a lot of the explanations that are offered to explain this miss the mark to varying degrees. You could call this Marxism, but this is very different from any traditional sort of Marxism. You could call it just more liberalism. I think it is accurate to call it liberalism, but at the same time, clearly there's a radical difference between modern liberals and liberals even of the 20th century. It's not really an explanation to look at the theories of John Locke or Thomas Hobbes and just say it was a direct line of descent from then, that as soon as a theory of property rights and individualism was formulated, that it was going to end up with the kind of borderline religious sacraments we saw last year with the BLM movement. And some in the more radical right.
Borderline religious is, I don't think you need to say borderline.
It would look to Christianity and say that this is a Christian movement, that wokeism is actually the true essence of Christianity. But this also, I think,
maybe it's a Christian heresy.
This is the mark, even though there may be some truth in it. Certainly we see this more in post-Christian societies than anywhere else. But to say that wokeism is the true essence of Christianity, that it's more true to Christianity than actual Christians, I think is very much mistaken. And when you look at the way that these people view the world, sure, there are similarities to Christianity, there is overlap, but there's also radical differences. There's positions that would be radically heretical to the Christian worldview. One way to analyze the phenomenon of wokeism is to look at the way that language has evolved in the last couple of decades under its influence. Recently, there was the trailer announced for the new Matrix movie. And it's interesting to look back at how much language has shifted since the original Matrix movie. Now,
we're back to the Matrix.
Wachowski sisters who directed the Matrix are both trans women. And they've since come out and said that the Matrix was something of an allegory for their struggle as trans people. Originally, there was a character called Switch who was meant to be male in the Matrix and female outside of the Matrix, or vice versa. And this was shelved by one of the producers. But you can see in the Matrix, there is this kind of Gnostic picture of the world that suggests that perhaps someone's real identity is, in a certain sense, outside of the confines, the prison of the material world. But at the
I don't think people understand how Gnostic the original Matrix was, as good as the movie was.
Time of the first Matrix, when people talked about transgenderism, that was seen as basically equivalent to being transvestite. It was a man or a woman acting out as the opposite gender. And in the years since the first Matrix, language has changed such that we recognize that a trans person was a man born in a woman's body, or vice versa. And this is a radical shift that is part of wokeism, that is actually...
I hope it doesn't mean recognize in the literal sense, but just kind of how we think of it now.
Transforming our whole understanding of reality. It's easy to laugh this stuff off as SJWism or whatever, but these things have come to define people's understanding of the world. They are through language and through normalization of certain concepts. They're shaping people's whole metaphysical understanding of things. And wokeism is a kind of metaphysics. It is a kind of pseudo-religion, I believe. But that transition wasn't the end point. Because we've even moved on from that conception of things where now sex itself is socially constructed. And gender is not binary in that one is born a man.
See, you're not just in the wrong body switch. It goes deeper, right? Kind of what the first video was talking about.
Or a woman in a man or a woman's body. But there is no binary of sex and there is no binary of gender. There's infinitely many genders, or gender is a kind of fluid spectrum. At that point, when gender is no longer binary, it has no connection to sex at all. It has no connection to...
Yep. Very excellent point here. Main critique of transgenderism, right?
To any reference point in the material world. So gender now is a subjective identity which no longer has any connection to anything in the physical world.
Bang
and
on.
is something that has no objective referent. It's just something that we understand someone to be based on how they describe themselves, and the categories that they use to describe themselves don't have any definition because, again, they're not connected to anything in the physical world. And people have come to accept this, but this is a radical revision of our whole understanding of reality. Now someone's identity is an entirely subjective, entirely interior thing. And people might think that this is quite similar to, say, a Christian understanding of the soul. You know, someone's soul inhabits their body, and of course their soul isn't physical, so it is a kind of ghost in the machine. But this isn't the traditional religious or Christian understanding of what the soul was. Traditionally, this kind of more radical dualism, where the soul or the psyche was totally separate from the material world and inhabited physical bodies as a ghost in the machine, was associated with heretical sects of Christianity like Gnosticism and non-Christian.
Very good. I remember in my Cambridge University Press reader of Aquinas, he has a good essay on, I guess it wasn't an essay, I am not my soul, right? You're both body and soul.
Christian movements like Manichaeism. But in Christianity, they took the Aristotelian view of things, this hylomorphic perspective, where we are composite beings. So far from being an external instrument, the body is part of our personal reality. And while it can't exist apart from the soul, it's not inferior. The idea of the soul in Orthodox Christianity would be the substantial form rather than the ghost in the machine. You can separate the body from the soul in analysis, but not in fact. There's this idea of the body-soul composite. And this is really the traditional understanding of things that was ruptured in the modern age, especially with Cartesianism. And you get this view of the world where there are two irreducible substances. There is the outside material world, there's matter, and then there is the interior subjective world of the psyche, and neither one is reducible to the other. Now, this is really the whole basis for the modern understanding of the world, and the modern project is a wholly inductive model of research combined with a totally mechanistic view of nature. And in this picture, what looked like elements of nature.
Yeah, I think tracing it back to Descartes sounds about right, based on my philosophical studies.
Misattributed to the human intellect are removed, like the idea of final causes, formal causes, purpose at all in nature. Now, when people like Francis Bacon were promoting the scientific method and promoting this use of inductive reasoning, this was never intended to serve as a metaphysic. But for the purposes of the scientific method, the interior, the subjective, was placed in a separate domain. But it was kind of inevitable that this pragmatic step would turn into a kind of metaphysics. And this kind of radical dualism, this radical separation of the interior and the exterior, the objective and the subjective, has become a popular metaphysic. And this lends itself...
All right. I think we kind of see where this is going, and I can use a metaphor. Probably an archery or other metaphor would do better, but I like, I guess, using more space metaphor. Small errors, you can see this in church history too with theology. Small errors up front are not that big a deal, right? They don't, but as they gain steam, as they keep going, kind of this duality separating soul and spirit from the material, that kind of Gnostic sort of lends itself to kind of a Gnostic way of thinking. As you get further in time, it becomes way more of a big deal. So it's kind of like if you're trying to, shoot something from 100 yards away. Yeah, a small error isn't going to be that big a deal. You're trying to launch a spacecraft to Pluto, right? A small error from 100 yards away is no big deal, but it shows up when you get to multiple billion miles away. And I think that's kind of what is happening. What we're seeing in today's society is we're seeing small errors in the past pick up steam. They're not maybe the only thing going on, but they're at least a sufficient cause of what's going on. I mean, combined with our immorality. Because there has to be something in our conscience that we know this is absurd.
Quite well to the idea that the interior self needs to be liberated from the constraints of the physical world. And that liberation, the purpose of that liberation is to give that interior self a free, open space of possibility. So choice really becomes sacrosanct. When there's a picture of a soul, that's intimately tied up with a conception of God, with a conception of objective values, with the conception of the good. The soul only makes sense in reference to a laidstone of an absolute good. And there is a perfectibility of the soul. When you have a totally mechanistic view of nature and you shift from the soul to the self, the distinction is that there's no objective good for a self. A self is more a kernel of subjectivity that's kind of encased in these multiple layers of physical constraint. And we're no longer really embedded or embodied in the world. Now we are thrown into the world. We're thrown into bodies. There's now a thrownness to our nature that's wholly arbitrary. And when you're thrown into the world like this, aspects of your identity that come from being an embodied creature, your sex, your race, your nation state, your particular traditions, your language, these are no longer valuable aspects of your identity. These are now false and arbitrary impositions that are actually hindrances to the true realization and exploration of your true self, which is something.
I think what he's saying here is making sense. It's not something, I don't think this is something, I've seen this before, so it's not new what he's saying, but it's not something that you can digest and just be like, it makes sense, but there may be some more wrinkles than he's thinking. But I don't think I would, if there is more to critique on him or more to say, I don't think I would get there without him bringing it up in the first place, if that makes sense.
Something that is wholly psychical, wholly subjective, and denied the chance for self-exploration and discovery by these arbitrary collective impositions. And so you can see how the liberal ideal of individual maximalism, or the
There we go.
leftist tendency toward liberation projects, takes on a special metaphysical, almost spiritual significance now. And while the woke left is quite a modern phenomenon, you can see its antecedents in the movement of modernism and leftists and liberals that attached themselves to that in the early 20th century in the United States. And modernism and people like Oscar Wilde and James Joyce and Friedrich Nietzsche were very focused on this idea of self-discovery. And this really comes to fruition with the existentialist movement of the mid-20th century and its maxim that existence precedes essence. The means of salvation in a meaningless, absurd universe that we're thrown into against our consent is this project of the absolute affirmation of the self. Now, the reason that things like the LGBT movement are so important, and the reason that wokeism has really brought this front and center, is because this really pushes this dualistic picture of the world into center focus. And when you think of the worst possible sins that you can commit today in terms of how it's viewed by the radical left, the worst thing that someone can be today is a racist. With a close second being if someone is sexist or homophobic. And another terrible thing that you can do is to generalize. It's just an accepted maxim now that you can't generalize. To generalize someone is evil, even if there's...
All right, I'm trying to remember. Racism doesn't seem to be tied to this. I know that it's like the number one sin. I mean, obviously it's a sin, and obviously it's bad, but why does the left view it as the number one sin? I'm kind of curious how he ties this in.
Good empirical reasons to think that a generalization may be accurate. It's just absolutely evil to impose that on someone. And what these have in common is that the worst possible sin in this pseudo-religion is to constrain the absolute freedom of someone's self with reference to something in the material world. If you claim that...
I think that's what's going on with transgenderism and stuff, and even with the LGBT stuff more broadly. But I'm kind of curious, not sure if the racism thing ties into that, or if that's just, for lack of a better term, virtue signaling. Like, everyone views it as wrong. So if I'm against it, I maximize my righteousness within the system. Because everybody has an inherent need to be justified.
Someone is limited by something biological about themselves, whether that's race or gender or something else, then you are affirming physical constraints over the subjective psyche, which is meant to be absolutely free. And the right and the left both justify themselves now with an appeal to the liberation of the self. In the case of the left, they believe that the self will be liberated by a destruction of prejudices, destruction of things like racism, homophobia, but also a destruction of those embedded identities themselves by an end to identification with national groups, with religious traditions, with gender. And the left believes that the best way to achieve this is through collective action, through the state. The establishment right disagrees, but it's really only a pragmatic disagreement. The right believes that this transhuman future will be achieved through the function of the market. And they certainly have history on their side when they point to the market as the force that has liberated people from traditional gender roles, that has destroyed traditions and ended prejudice, brought women into the workforce, and so on. And this is the disagreement of establishment politics today. And both
That's pretty interesting. For good and bad, I guess, right? Yeah, this is definitely something you have to think about.
justify their side of the project with reference to an absolute evil. And the absolute evil since the Second World War has been the Nazis. And Nazism occupies this kind of metaphysical evil because it is the affirmation of the physical over the psychic, to the point of a people being wiped out just for a physical characteristic. It's the absolute denial of that interior
Or a racial characteristic, right? Or they're in the wrong ethnicity.
space of that group which was persecuted. And so the left and the right both justify their positions as basically the best position to prevent another genocide.
I'm here for Paul's comment. Absolutist view of the free market advances the liberal order. Yeah. And I don't know if 10 years ago I would have recognized that or been for that. Equals erasing any obligations based on innate nature. Yeah. All right. So his point coming up is interesting in terms of like the kind of the project has been prevent like what happened in World War II. So let me back up just a few seconds and then let's hit this again.
For the psychic, to the point of a people being wiped out just for a physical characteristic. It's the absolute denial of that interior space of that group which was persecuted. And so the left and the right both justify their positions as basically the best position to prevent another genocide. The left says that genocide was caused by racism, by tribalism, by racial collectivism. And so the focus should be on destroying that kind of racial collectivism through collective action. The right disagrees and says that genocide was caused by statism, by the worship of the state.
Both.
And the way to prevent something like that arising again, the way to prevent collective racialism is through weakening the state and promoting individualism, individual maximalism, and individual rights. And this is the dynamic, this is the dialectic of liberal pluralist societies that is accelerating and becoming more explicit now with wokeism. And what's interesting is that many of the early proponents of what we now recognize as sort of woke left ideas were also proponents of transhumanism. The best example is Martine Rothblatt. Martine Rothblatt is a trans woman who has donated hundreds of millions to advocacy for the transgender movement. And she wrote a book called From Transgender to Transhuman, a manifesto on the freedom of form, which in my
sounds like we need to read that to figure out what's going to happen next, but that's just me.
My opinion is maybe the ultimate manifesto for what's called wokeism, because in From Transgender to Transhuman, Martine Rothblatt says explicitly that transgenderism is really to be understood as a first step. It's the bringing in of this revolution of the freedom of form, as she says. And she spells out clearly that this new picture of the world is about
some war against Plato or Aristotle or something.
Liberating the self.
I know it's actually a war against God, but it's a war against the created order. I think my late pastor years ago thought this stuff was kind of a return to kind of paganism, where it's just like the smush out all the differences, kind of erase the created order
from the physical world, and technology will be the means by which that is achieved, where eventually, just as prejudices towards sex disappeared as women entered the workplace, that technology will make it so that none of these physical differences matter anymore. We'll all be augmented. It will be possible to separate our consciousness from the body. And so talking about someone's identity as related to the body, the physical world at all, is just going to become outdated by technology. And transgenderism is really just a first step on the road to that recognition. In the conclusion to that book, she writes, quote, "Together, law and science, heat and light, are the tools we must use to liberate society's potential for unlimited expression of sexual identity. As we do so, we evolve from wise man, Homo sapiens, to creative person, persona creatus. We emerge from our prison of sex into a frontier of gender. We step from..."
I get that. So sex is a prison. Gender is the liberation, right? Physical constraint. You're imprisoned by your physical constraint. And then whatever you conceive you are is what you are. Okay.
From a history of biological limits up to a future of cultural choice. We unleash at long last the full, unbridled power of human diversity on our planet's prolific problems. The outcome of this gender awakening will be a new species, a new transhumanity, one that has as its fundamental purpose the assurance of a healthy and fulfilling life for all who value that right. Now, I think if anything captures what wokeism is, it's this passage. She's affirming here the project, the utopian project of the liberation of humanity from form, from nature. And you can see the kind of religious nature of this, where we started out with this constraint of the natural world, and we are progressing gradually to this eschatological horizon of the final liberation of the self, of humanity, from the constraints of nature. And in this kind of pseudo-religion, as you can see, technology takes on religious significance. Technology, techno-capital, is the means by which we are liberated from the physical world. Now, there's a wonderful coincidence of wants here between what Martine Rothblatt is promoting and other aspects of the post-war order and the desires of the oligarchs. Not only does this line up perfectly with the post-World War II mythos that justifies the exclusion of nationalism from the public square on the basis of the inevitability of genocide if people collectivize racially in the West. It marries itself perfectly to that because...
What's a collectivization based on that? A nationality. That's National Socialism.
If the absolute good in this pseudo-religion is the liberation of humanity from the constraints of nature, then again, the absolute evil is judging people on the basis of physical characteristics, is racism and racists. And so the Satan-like figure in this view of the world is Hitler. And so that lines up perfectly as the negative aspect of the positive vision of the world being promoted by this transhuman view of things. But there's...
so maybe the proper corrective is viewing it as all the different nationalities, all the different ethnicities were created by God for his glory. All the different tongues, kind of like a picture of Revelation, as opposed to let's get rid of all these differences. I'm just thinking out loud here. Wouldn't that be the proper solution? Kind of root it in God's created order instead of getting rid of God's created order. And recognizing that the bigotry, when it's wrong, comes from a sinful heart, but isn't properly aligned with how God views the created order.
There's also a perfect coincidence of wants between what the woke transhumanist movement wants and what the oligarchs and international capital wants. Both want the destruction of inborn identity. Both want this fluid picture of humanity where someone's identity is decided entirely by choice. For the capitalist, that's consumer choice. And the capitalist desires a destruction of anything that is a barrier to profit. And traditional social orders.
Again, 10, 20 years ago, I'm not sure I would have been agreeable to hear this. But here I am. A lot of water under the bridge.
Traditional moral systems, traditional gender roles, nationalism, these are all barriers to international capitalism. They're all barriers to commodification. They're all barriers to the capitalist ideal of a borderless, globalist world in which prejudice is absent. And again, people are purely defined by consumer choice, and there's no barrier to those people consuming. In fact, there's a necessity to them consuming because consumption comes to define their identity. And so the woke left's project of emancipation also becomes the international capitalists' project of commodification. And this is why wokeism has been and will continue to be so successful, because it gives a religious-like legitimacy to the projects of the oligarchs to create an international global market and the project of the Atlanticist powers since the Second World War to prevent an outbreak of nationalism. And finally, as mentioned, it gives a religious significance to techno-capital itself as the means that has liberated humanity and will eventually liberate humanity from the physical world itself. Now, it's interesting that this kind of belief system would pop up at what seems to be the end of an empire, the end of a period in history, and Gnosticism, that dual.
I don't think the Chinese are going to be into this. That's just me. They're not into this.
Christian heresy popped up at the end of antiquity, and some people have compared the woke left to Gnosticism. You can certainly see the similarities in the picture I've laid out. But what's different is, Gnosticism was a kind of Western Buddhism, and it still had a spiritual picture of the world. It still had a picture of ultimate reality, and it was ultimately pessimistic about the potential for liberation within nature. Ultimately, the point of Gnosticism was to turn away from the world to achieve gnosis or enlightenment, union with the true God beyond the evil demiurge, and reject the physical world. It was a pessimistic creed, but it was also a spiritual creed, whereas this transhumanist picture of things, this selfism, maybe is a good way to describe it, this absolute commitment to
even worse than Gnosticism.
Liberation of the self. This is fundamentally an optimistic view of the world. Again, it sees things as progressing inevitably from constraint and prejudice and imposition of inborn identities to liberation of the self and the free choice of the self liberated through technology.
It's like Gnosticism 2.0.
And it also lacks a spiritual aspect. It doesn't have a picture of ultimate reality except the mechanistic scientific view of the world, which is bound up with technological progress, which ultimately will serve as the liberation of humanity. But this always remains a wholly immanent project. There isn't an absolute good. There isn't a gnosis or an enlightenment. There isn't a God to commune with. And there isn't eternal life, except potentially an infinitely extended life through augmentation and technology. Even in Gnosticism, there was a certain inborn difference in the quality of people. There were hylics or somatics, who were the lowest of people, who it was said would never be able to achieve gnosis. And there were psychics and pneumatics, who were higher types who were more open to enlightenment or to the gnosis, to an understanding of things. Even that is absent from this
like a muggle or something.
transhumanist, selfist view of things. So there's none of the spiritual value of traditional religious structures in this. It's a wholly imminent utopian project that finds its fulfillment in the material world and in this project of liberation. And that's why adherents to this pseudo-religion are so animated, so motivated, so aggressive in a way that, say, traditionalists are not. Because the traditionalist doesn't believe that their ultimate purpose, their ultimate realization or liberation will come in this life. The adherent to wokeism is entirely fixed on this utopian endpoint, this eschatological horizon of liberation of humanity from the material world. And that's
So when we challenge wokeism, we're challenging their. We're moving the eschaton away from them in Christian terms, right?
why I think wokeism is here to stay. It's not just a fad. It's not just millennials with too much time on their hands. It's not just something that was conjured by a few think tanks to distract people from economic issues. It is a pseudo-religion with all of the animating force and conviction of any other religion, maybe more so. And it's the realization of a number of tendencies and assumptions that have been present in Western thought for centuries now. And that's really why
That's why I said small errors accumulate over time. The trajectory goes off.
conservatives are part of why conservatives have been so ineffective in pushing back against this stuff, is because they don't have a similar animating force that can drive them to the kind of.
Just going to pause for a comment here from Jack. Well, yeah, that's how it always happens in reality. It's like the meme, right? Like, oh, we have a socialist paradise now, so I get to, write poetry all day instead of waiting tables, and it's like up against the wall, right? The reality of when it comes is that a lot of these people are going to be, I guess, useful idiots, maybe. I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. If we're not in the gulag dead before.
Fanaticism that this picture of the world, this selfism can. And even if they achieve sort of piecemeal legislation like removing critical race theory from schools, something along those lines, in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Because this pseudo-religion, this metaphysical picture of the world, has come to be the basis for most people's moral beliefs. Through culture, through language, through imposition, it is the basis for how we frame our moral positions. And it may be that only an equally radical, comprehensive religious view of things can actually dislodge this and push
Yep. Evangelism.
back against it. But what form that will take, how or if it will manifest, remains to be seen.
Okay. I think Jack or Paul is the only people watching right now. I'll keep this under an hour because I've been going to too many 3-hour things. He has another video on Keith Wood. I think that's Keith Wood. Link should already be in the description to the main video. He has a more recent video on this topic I haven't seen, so I didn't want to go over it, but it's really fascinating, and it's kind of that it's deeper, right? You feel like you're in a chess game, and Satan is doing a lot of moves, setting up the board, and you're just a pawn, which I guess is the kind of the case. So, all right, unless anybody has any comments, I'm going to sign off, and let me know if you want me to do the other video from him sometime, or if not, just go to his channel and maybe watch some of his other videos. They're quite good. Again, doesn't seem to be quite from a Christian perspective, but he seems to understand stuff out of our worldview, or at least when things got, at least how our heresies impacted the world. So, all right, have a good night. Have a good week. God bless.